Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
As AI reshapes geopolitics faster than diplomacy can respond, the dream of global governance faces its greatest test. This tension between innovation and regulation is precisely what makes today's conversation so timely. I'm your host, Medlir Mema, and I'm joined today by Caryn Lusinchi, a senior non-resident fellow at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels and credentialed AI auditor for the EU AI Act and GDPR. Given her experience advising the U.S. federal government on AI governance and her background in scaling machine learning technologies at Meta and Google, Caryn brings a rare perspective of someone who has witnessed this regulatory challenge from both sides of the equation and, might I add, both sides of the ocean. Caryn, welcome to Age of AI.
Hi, thank you for having me.
This has been a while in making, so I'm happy to have you on our podcast. Caryn, let's start right away by discussing global AI governance, which seems increasingly challenged by geopolitical fragmentation. Is the idea of global AI governance now too utopian, given the recent shifts around the world?
I think global governance was too idealistic even before the recent shifts in the new geopolitical world order, and I'll give you two main reasons. I think number one, AI global governance and regulation is only as good as its enforcement mechanism. So even if there are international agreements or consensus on AI governance are reached, enforcing those agreements globally is an immense challenge. Global AI governance would require the creation of a single universal agreed upon set of benchmarks or tests for assessing AI to monitor compliance. However, the reality is there is not a singular test or benchmark to essentially monitor AI. There are several benchmarks and evaluation methods out there in market that compare the performance of different AI models, but none of them offer a comprehensive measure of an AI system's overall capabilities. It's really a rough approximation of performance and risk. And I think if nations might either ignore this if they don't have a universal benchmark, or they might have insufficient enforcement capabilities for evaluating, for example, explainability or AI safety. A second reason is really around private tech companies. A lot of them drive AI innovation, but they hold a huge disproportionate amount of power. And when their interests conflict with public good, it's uncertain whether they would even abide by these global governance frameworks if it hampers their ability to innovate, profit, or access data. And I do think this corporate influence could weaken any global governance efforts as you have different lobbyists enter stage right and left in the US and globally.
So would you then be skeptical of claims? I know Sam Altman has said, please regulate us. I think we've heard from Meta as well saying, please regulate us. It seems, at least in this second point you just pointed out, that maybe we shouldn't take them at face value. That in fact, even though they're saying one thing, that means something entirely different.
I do think there's a lot of momentum for the idea of self-governance. A lot of the private tech companies are like, listen, government does not quite have the brain power to understand this technology. So let us leverage our R&D and our labs to help you navigate this, to ultimately redline a lot of policy, such as the EU AI Act. Even looking at a lot of the code of conducts coming out for GPAI. So it definitely is very much in their kind of self-interest to offer those services or navigation to a lot of governments around the world right now.
Well, since you mentioned the UI Act, for a moment, just go on the other side of the pond. Although this is a global podcast, depending which side, but let's go to Europe for a minute, okay? How would you assess? I know you were in Paris. You spent some time there in February. And there are a lot of meetings in and around the Paris AI Action Summit. How would you assess the impact of initiatives like the Paris AI Action Summit? Where does that particular meeting and set of meetings fit within this broader conversation about AI governance?
Well, I do think just the name itself, if you look at the name, the Paris AI Action Summit, I think for the first time, it really shifted away from a safety focus to one of action or AI adoption. And it essentially is pivoting to broader themes around adoption, innovation, investment, sustainability versus previous years, which was focused on safety and risk management. And it's really been rebranded under the umbrella of AI opportunity. I do think it was the most inclusive AI summit. A total of 61 countries and regional blocs signed the final declaration, compared to 29 in Bletchley and 11 previously in Seoul. But yet you have the UK and the US were notably absent in that agreement, and they're abstaining for different reasons. The US essentially decided not to sign based on multilateralism. They objected to references of inclusivity, diversity, and environmental challenges. The UK, on the other hand, felt that the actual declaration didn't provide enough practical or pragmatic solutions on global governance, nor really sufficiently addressed more challenging questions around security. So I do think what we're seeing as a result in the aftermath of the Paris AI Action Summit is the Brussels effect, or the EU AI Act influence from regulation versus innovation going to persist long term? Or perhaps will regulatory models have to be watered down or be reinvented?
Well, that comment actually anticipates my next question a little bit, because whenever we talk about Europe and we talk about the EU AI Act as well, and as far as at least my understanding of the Action Summit in Paris was the French government's attempt to as well challenge, maybe, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, some of the at least norms established by and the rules established by the EU AI Act. But you mentioned this idea of the Brussels effect. The EU AI Act was positioned initially as a potential global standards. Do you see this influence persisting long term, or is it already, I guess we've already seen evidence, in fact, that's not going to be the case? Or are we seeing competing regulatory models prevailing instead?
I don't think it's a question of competing models, but I do think that every single kind of AI regulation in Europe or globally that is drafted and enforceable today, I believe is in peril of being obsolete in about 1 or 2 years' time. The law already lags behind a lot of technology's accelerants. If you look at kind of GDPR and the EU AI Act, they're still trying to retrofit in GPAI. A lot of the code of conducts are essentially being delayed in their release. And I do think the evolution of vibe computing, you have agentic AI, and really the march towards quantum computing isn't stopping for policymakers. And I really think regulation and policymaking institutions require, I think, a significant reinvention and agility to kind of adapt to not only today's AI adoption, but tomorrow's emergent technologies that they might have not forecasted or anticipated.
So that seems to cast some doubt on the capacity of regulatory frameworks to enforce any of these new technologies. Do you have any faith that actually regulatory enforcement mechanisms can realistically scale to match the pace of innovations like DeepSeek models or quantum computing applications? Or is this just a cat and mouse game, and we're just never going to be able to get ahead of that? At this point, the EU AI Act is so passé because we have this new technology, so these new models or other types of applications that any attempt to regulate them is just futile.
I definitely think there's a challenge in kind of human resourcing. I mean, you look to the EU AI office, they have a unit of around 100 employees, and a lot of critics are saying that's vastly understaffed. Only a fraction of them apparently work on actually implementing the AI Act. You compare that with the newly instituted UK AI Safety Institute, which employs around 150 staff. So I do think it's a human resource issue. Another part of the problem, I think, with the EU AI Act is that it leaves it up to individual countries to decide whether they want to set their own dedicated AI regulator to oversee use, or whether they want an existing authority in a country, namely a data protection authority, to add AI monitoring to their remit. And I really think enforcement doesn't really scale because a lot of those DPAs are already underwater dealing with a backlog of complaints relating to GDPR. So they can't even get to GPAI. And I do think DeepSeek, when you're talking about emergent technologies, really essentially speak to the challenge of really scaling up human. And I ultimately think we're reaching an inflection point where AI is going to have to police AI with humans in the loop. DeepSeek, for example, pioneered an approach called mixture of experts, which leverages multiple neural networks specializing in different fields to come up with solutions instead of relying on one model. And I do think our current regulation did not anticipate governance with multiple models.
So AI governing AI is what you're saying, and then maybe with a few humans sprinkled here and there, just to keep an eye on it.
Correct.
Okay, so we have this. There's a lot there. I'm trying to process some of that stuff, and not all of it is good news. And I think that's like part of my concern here. But so there is this global governance aspect that we've discussed a little bit. And now you've thrown this new element in it that maybe there's a different model with AI itself, perhaps also governing this with humans in the loop. There's been a lot of talk also, especially over the last year, I would say. I remember even at the UN, some of the future, there was a lot of talk about this rise of sovereign AI programs. So everybody, global north, global south, everybody wants to have, data sovereignty and sovereign AI program. And so we're seeing as a result, more nations invest in sovereign AI capabilities with predictable results, of course, concerns about privacy and everything else, but as well as the impact on climate change and capabilities. What's driving, you think, the trend? I think you've hinted at this a little bit, but what's driving this trend beyond the obvious security concerns? Everybody wants to protect their own data, but is there anything else that's driving this interest in sovereign AI capabilities and programs?
I do think you have to kind of look a little bit to history in the past at countries and nation states' efforts to kind of wall off citizen information. And ultimately, I do think the rise of sovereign AI really at the birthplace was really around data sovereignty. Essentially, I think this is critical for countries concerned about privacy, data security, and the ability to regulate how data is used, especially in the context of AI. And by maintaining control of that data, you can ensure that citizens' data is protected from foreign surveillance and misuse. I also think a big driver is economic competitiveness. I do think a lot of countries are recognizing the need to invest more and build domestic AI capabilities to stay competitive. And that could be investment in local industry, infrastructure, jobs, talent, which ultimately over time reduces the reliance on foreign technology providers. And I think the third thing is really around supply chain resilience. I think we saw with COVID, the pandemic, certain supply chain challenges, or worse in the future, if war. I think countries are increasingly aware of the risks when you have global dependency on supply chains, especially for critical technologies like AI. And I do think sovereign AI and the momentum towards that can help reduce reliance on foreign suppliers for hardware, software, services, and talent to essentially have resilience against external shocks.
So I'm going to push this a little bit further. Do you think that, in your view, and just given what's happening recently, do you think technological sovereignty in AI is actually a realistic goal for nations outside the U.S. and maybe China? I mean, I know the desire is there and the motivation, as you just laid out, and whether it's the economic profit motive or security concerns or privacy or whatever, but what you want is different from what you can actually get. Is it attainable for countries? Let's think about even the global south, right? Developing countries, and leave aside for a moment the EU and the UK or China. What do you think?
So I do think it's a balancing act. And I do think the wild card is really user behavior. User behavior is really hard to control. For example, you might go ahead and successfully create a nation state LLM India's done it, APAC's done it, Africa's done it. But users have to adopt it widespread versus using a lot of the free and very heavily hyped and promoted kind of Western or Chinese free models like ChatGPT or DeepSeek. And I do think there are also economic disparities in many nations outside the US and China who might not have kind of the historic economic clout to match the amount of investment and PhD and masters, especially in R&D and labs in AI, to compete on a talent front. I think they're playing catch up. And I do think there's some aspect of kind of short-term locked in technological dependencies. I think a lot of countries currently are depending in some sense of their end-to-end kind of AI stack on foreign technologies, whether they're semiconductors or even cloud providers, to essentially make it really hard to achieve overnight or in the short term. Brazil, for instance, is starting to move towards that sovereign path by investing really heavily in local cloud providers so they can essentially reduce the reliance on US companies like AWS and Microsoft, which right now are controlling a lot of AI management and pipelines for deployment.
So Brazil, I guess, is one, and you're saying that's one path. What other strategies, in your mind at least, have been the most effective for countries? Again, let's stay maybe with the developing world, but trying to reduce dependence on U.S. big tech companies. I imagine in Europe, there's a lot of conversation about this as well. I know the French very much want to develop their own, and they've been able to develop their own LLM. And so I guess two-part question. One is the strategies that countries have tried to adopt to become less dependent on U.S. big tech. But secondly, is the development of your own sovereign LLM in a way a prerequisite to lessening that dependence?
I think it's kind of, I don't think you can look at it as an isolation. I do think it's an accumulative strategy. I'll give an example. In India, India has something called India's Digital India Initiative. And essentially, for a long time, India is realizing it's not only about the AI, but it's the digital infrastructure in which that commercially embedded AI is in. And essentially, it's spent a lot of time and investment in encouraging the development of local alternatives to major US services. So, for example, as an alternative to PayPal, they have their own app. They have essentially a big telecom that competes with US telecoms. They have an Indian version of TikTok. So in some sense, I do think there has to be, along with kind of building your own kind of nation state or local LLM, there has to also be momentum to creating an equally robust tech ecosystem for investment and growth to go along with that. So
this feels almost like the revenge of the 80s and 90s, I guess, when we're talking about India and India trying to develop its own industry. So it feels like ISI. So instead of export-led growth, you go to import, substitution, industrialization. And for countries like India, I suppose, even though they tried in the past and didn't work out for them, but at least they have economies of scale. And arguably, Brazil has the same thing and some of the other ones. But if you're a medium size or a small country, you're out of luck. I mean, you're basically a price taker here, or you're a technology taker. And the most you can do is try and lure in all these big tech companies from the United States primarily, and hope that they can help you develop some kind of a sovereign capability, but you have to make the deal with the devil. Is that more or less the picture?
I think it depends who you partner with. I mean, again, I know NVIDIA had a sovereign AI program that they were doing with developing nations even before ChatGPT. But as far as the impacts of those, I think more time will tell to see the impact and the kind of success stories to come out of those nations, given the fact that this is more of a long-term investment. It isn't something you're going to see in weeks or months, just given the amount of dollars and, I would say, organizational and public sector change management that needs to occur.
What about this economies of scale argument? When we think of economies of scale in the case of AI, do we run into the same kinds of concerns and considerations as we have in traditional trade, or are those concerns lessened? Do you have to be a super large, super big country to make sense to have your own LLM or to have your own kind of, again, sovereign AI? Or can small countries also aspire to those because the point is actually, the threshold is lower than it used to be, let's say, for trade or for making cars or trains or whatever it is?
I think if you're looking at purely kind of digital goods or the future, I do think one of the strategies that are most effective for countries trying to reduce dependence on kind of those big tech companies is really, I think a lot of them are experimenting with how do they foster open source alternatives to essentially like reduce the dependency on proprietary tech. And I do think that will really play out with kind of as the cost of agentic AI, as well as the fact if you no longer need a computer science degree to actually code and you create huge accessibility to not only university or academic students, but anyone that essentially can interface with either through voice or through a chat mechanism to develop an app or a company. I do think the accessibility to AI across your citizens or your population will also get more people participating in some of that accessibility as well as the democratization of that kind of technology. But then again, there are certain risks as well.
Yeah. Just maybe for a few minutes before we wrap this up, the U.S. picture on AI governance. Obviously, I think with Trump coming in and upending a lot of U.S. commitments, I think one of the approaches has been also a different approach, to say the least, with regards to AI regulation as well. How would you characterize, first of all, that approach? And second, what can we look forward to in that respect?
I guess if I was to sum up the U.S. approach towards AI regulation, I would say we're very much within the course of the past 3 months, very much an anti-regulatory environment. I would say that anything or anyone that gets in the way of AI development and deployment speed is essentially dynamited. And also given the recent cutbacks in NIST, which is a pretty sizable contributor to cutting edge work and topics such as AI, cybersecurity, and quantum computing, I think really the fate and future evolutions and iterations and persistence of even a lot of responsible AI standards really hangs in the balance, given the fact there's been a lot of layoffs of staffers, technical lab directors, as well as senior staff quitting. What you're seeing is kind of I would say a new reinvention of AI. Gone is the safe, secure, and trustworthy development use of artificial intelligence. There's a new executive order, which is really about removing barriers to America leadership in AI. So really it's more around America's global AI dominance in terms of national security and AI as essentially a competition between US and China. So I do think in the US, it's really repositioned as a freedom to innovate, which essentially from a nuanced perspective is really around the consolidation of political and financial and tech power to achieve those aims.
Just completely as an aside, how does this fit within, everybody talks about Musk's influence on this administration, but I understand that Musk, a couple of years back, I forget how long it's been now, when he was one of the co-signatories to the, let's just stop for 6 months, let's reconsider everything, and let's think about this before we get to an inflection point and that there's no way back. How do we make sense of all this? Or does he not have as much of an influence when it comes to AI policy that the rest of the tech representatives that are in and around the Trump administration, that they probably have his ear on that rather than just Trump, just Musk?
I don't really have a crystal ball. I
Right.
think anyone anticipated the kind of velocity of what's happened in the last 3 months of essentially a private enterprise that was not elected in terms of having such political power or clout. I think it remains to be seen whether there's a frontier model or LLM that gets nationalized. I mean, you definitely have OpenAI and our Oracle with Stargate, but then you have competing models with Elon Musk's Grok. I don't know if within the new EO order under the new administration, there's enough room for two players.
Whether from Musk's perspective, there's room for more than one player. That's the other thing.
Correct. I think everyone's placing their chips on the roulette wheel.
We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
Well, I guess with that, let's just final question. This has been a very rapid fire interview. I've loved it that we've been able to get a lot of information in there. So I really appreciate your succinctness and also your ability to just share so much with us and inform us. Here's my last question for you. And I don't know if it's a positive and an optimistic one or not, but what gives you hope about the future of AI governance, if any? Please say there's something that gives you hope. If not, then I guess I'll accept it. But is there anything that does?
I would say I do think there's enough people that are really passionate and also very much drinking from a fire hose from a technological perspective that want to get more involved in actually creating governance and policy that's agile and sustainable. But I also think that group of people need to really address emergent risks, which are much different than essentially a lot of the concerns we have right now with your ordinary content producing LLMs. And I do think it's super critical within the next, I would say, 6 months to a year to start redrafting or rewriting or putting new, I would say, frameworks in place. Governance might be a little ambitious to essentially start looking at agents. You have Manus that just came out of China to compete with ChatGPT's operator, and you're really dealing at different AI risks, including miscoordination. What happens when agents fail to cooperate, even when they share goals? You're dealing with a conflict where agents worked actively together to work against each other. And then there's also collusion when they engage in undesirable cooperation. And I don't think any of our current frameworks or law can really anticipate the new horizon of global governance that is going to need to be invented or even brainstormed. Some of that could be role-based governance. How do you assign governance roles to individual agents? Community inclusive governance. How do you build feedback loops from end users and stakeholders into agents to make sure that user needs and expectations? And then there's even hierarchical oversight models. Where do AI and humans fit in to these new paradigms? And so I'm kind of excited. I think there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. And there's a lot of smart people that literally, I think, collectively can take this on. So.
Well, I'll take that as an optimistic answer. I heard the word excited there. So I'll take it. I think this is a good place to stop this conversation. Caryn, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And for our listeners, that's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.